Well, good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Oh, that was pretty robust. Not bad. For those of you I haven't met, and for those of you who don't recognize me with all of this marvelous hair that I grew during my sabbatical, I am the Reverend Jennifer Brower, and on behalf of my colleagues on the ministry team, the Reverend Ned White and Reverend Natalie Fenimore, and our ministerial intern, Nancy Reed McKee, it is my privilege to welcome you this morning to the Unitarian Universalist congregation at Shelter Rock and to our service. As people of the Unitarian Universalist faith, we celebrate the spirit of life that dwells within all of creation. We honor the diversity of belief brought together in our gathering, and we affirm the use of reason and personal experience in our search for the transcendent. We hope that all who cross our threshold will feel warmly received and encouraged in their spiritual growth. If you're a newcomer joining us today, know that we're very glad that you're here, that you made it up the long drive on this gray, rainy morning. If you will, you'll notice in the pew rack ahead of you there are some visitor information cards. If you'd like, you could complete one of those for us and turn that into the offering plate as it goes around during the collection of the offering. You have an opportunity there to let us know that you're here and to also ask some questions or to ask for more information about this congregation's many ministries or Unitarian Universalism in general. Following our service this morning, as we do just about every Sunday, we have our UU Cafe, which is held in the social hall just across the lobby. UU Cafe is an opportunity for coffee and conversation, for gathering to meet longtime friends and meet some new folks, and where lunch can be purchased for a modest price. If you're a newcomer today, know that we invite you to stay for lunch and would like you to be our guest. Guest tickets can be found at the welcome table or handed out by a volunteer near the doors of the social hall. They're little golden tickets. There you go, your golden ticket for a free lunch. Kind of like Willy Wonka, but just a little different. Before we enter into our service proper, I have some announcements to share with you, and so I'd encourage you to take this time to turn off your cell phone or your watch or whatever might make a whole lot of noise during this morning's service. I don't know if we have any children in the building to help us turn off these devices, but I'm sure we can find someone if you're in need of assistance. You'll find in the back of the order of service a schedule for the coming week and beyond. There are many programs there. I'll just lift up a couple for you. Next Saturday, March the 3rd, we'll have our third annual congregational dance. The Any Given Sunday band will be playing. Our congregational band will be playing. We hope you will come and be part of that. That's at 8 p.m. in the social hall. Indeed, it's good to move, but you will need to get home early enough to be back on Sunday morning, all right? You have a commitment here at 11 a.m. on Sunday the 4th to be back for our service that morning. Congregation of Our Hopes will be led by the ministry team. Ned will be leading that service with Natalie and Nancy. I will not be able to be with you, I am sorry to say. Nathaniel is my son, not that Nathaniel. My son is playing in the All-County Honor Band in Syracuse. So thank you for letting me throw that in there in my moment of mother pride. So I am missing you for a good cause, but I will look forward to hearing about that service and the statements of our hopes and dreams. After the service that morning will be our committee Sunday fair, so I do hope that you will attend and bring friends with you if you like, folks who might be interested in learning more about our congregation and our good works here. So next weekend is a very busy weekend. There are a whole bunch of announcements following those two, of course, many activities with our social justice program, of course, as well as other committees and programs within the congregation, and you'll find a series of advertisements in the back of that order of service. Before I invite you to greet one another, I have the privilege of welcoming our guest preacher for this morning, the Reverend, I'm sorry, you're not the Reverend, but you may someday be, who knows, Dan McKanan. Dr. Dan McKanan is a scholar of religion and social transformation who has taught at Harvard Divinity School since 2008. Dan holds the Emerson Chair, which was created to renew Harvard's historic connection to Unitarian Universalism. And we here at UUCSR are very proud, very, very proud that our congregation helped to support the establishment of the Emerson Chair. We've been privileged to have Dan come and visit us a few times since 2008, and so we're very glad he's here. Dan also serves on the UU panel for theological education and on the board of the UU History and Heritage Society. He is the author, most recently, of Prophetic Encounters, Religion and the American Radical Tradition, and Eco-Alchemy, Anthroposophy, and the History and Future of Environmentalism. Dan is a busy man with lots of big words in his vocabulary. Indeed, we should applaud that. Dan lives in Somerville, has a marvelous sense of humor, has a lovely spouse and daughter. He is a proud member of the Unitarian Universalist Church of Medford, and we are very pleased to have him with us this morning. Thank you, Dan, for being with us. We're glad you're here. Following our service in UU Cafe, Dan will be leading a book discussion group here in the Art Gallery at 1:30, and you'll find information about that back in the order of service if you have a moment to look at that. The book discussion will be around a documentary history of Unitarian Universalism. Books will be available for purchase and for signing. So I have my eye on a copy. I'll have to get it out of the bin before the rest of you get a hold of them. I'm just kidding. But Dan will be there at 1:30. So I do hope you'll have the opportunity to meet him one-on-one and enjoy participation in that book discussion group. And now, friends, we've welcomed Dan. It's time to welcome each other to the Unitarian Universalist congregation this morning. But before you get up and move, I'm going to remind you, it's flu season. You may not want to touch each other. It's okay. There are ways of greeting that don't involve shaking hands. So do what feels right for you and your health, and it is a pleasure to see you all this morning. Feel free to meet and greet.
come into this place, bringing both the joys and the sorrows of the week. Come into this place whether you seek peace or revolution, quiet comfort or loud celebration. Come into this place whether you've been here since the beginning or are here for the very first time. In all our diversity, let us worship together. May the flame of this chalice fill the depths of our souls with warmth and light, transforming the substance of our lives into gifts for the world. Please rise in body or spirit and join in singing hymn 295, Sing Out Praises for the Journey, 295 in the gray hymn book.
Would you join now in reciting our words of affirmation, which are printed in your order of service? Love is the doctrine of this congregation. The quest of truth is its sacrament, and service is its prayer. To dwell together in peace, to seek knowledge and freedom, to serve human need. This do we affirm and covenant with each other. Our congregation is a living entity, and like all living things, in order to survive and thrive, it must have the proper sustenance and care and tending and nurture. Its breath and its heartbeat, its life force are derived from us, its living components. Our congregation thrives and grows only with our care and tending, only with the life and energy and resources that we provide. An offering will now be made in support of the congregation we together sustain. May the sharing of our gifts serve to deepen our commitments to this faith, which has enriched our living and offers a message of hope to our world. Would the ushers please come forward? In this time before our spoken meditation, we invite you into a moment of private, prayerful reflection. During this time, we hold in heart and mind our own and each other's hopes and hurts. This morning, we hold Janet Bendowitz and her family tenderly in our hearts as they are newly bereaved and mourning the death of Janet's husband, Mel. May Janet find comfort being here with us this morning. For this spoken concern, and for all of those held in the private sanctuary of each of our hearts, may we hold each other with tenderness and gentleness and kindness today, knowing that there's so much more we carry around with us than anyone can ever see. As you desire, you are invited to come forward and to light a candle in silence in one of the 2 candle boxes.
let us turn our hearts in a spirit of prayerful connection to one another, to this place, to the world we share, and to the boundless source of creativity that calls us to make every moment a new beginning. May those who have gathered here find love and friendship in one another. May we speak truthfully, listen deeply, and act compassionately in response to what we have heard. May those who are grieving find comfort and healing in the presence of friends. May we renew our commitment to this congregation, to the building that shelters us, to the leaders who guide us, to the ministries that connect us to our neighbors, and to the heritage that is ever growing. May we find here the strength and the vision to reach out to a suffering world with love, to an unjust world with courageous action, and to a wise world with humility. And may we find ourselves supported by the love that flows through these people, this congregation, and this world, giving birth to new life in every moment. Amen, and blessed be. After that stirring music, we will stir you up a bit more with a reading from a sermon by Mary Safford, one of the prophetic sisterhood who brought Unitarianism to Iowa at the end of the 19th century. If there are any here today who rejoice in the great truths of the liberal faith but are doing nothing to support this faith, let me urge you for your own sake as well as the sake of others, no longer to be disobedient unto this heavenly vision. If you have money to give, give it freely, give it gladly. If silver and gold you have none, give time, give thought, give work, give anything you have the power to give that will strengthen this church and help to make it a beacon light to storm-tossed souls. If you can do nothing more than simply come to church, be sure to come every Sunday. Come not merely for your own sake, but also for the sake of the noble cause that is strengthened by your presence and your interest. Stay not outside. Ask not, is it a fashionable church? Is it a popular church? Is it a wealthy church? Ask only, is it a church that proves the right to be by the grand truths it proclaims, the good work it does, the noble lives it helps create? Obey your heavenly vision, be loyal to the truth you see, bravely stand by your convictions and work for the human good. Then life will grow divine. This morning, I'd like to talk about why Unitarian Universalists love institutions so much, and how we can use that love to bless the world. Please hear me clearly. This is not a sermon about why we ought to love institutions. My claim is that we do love institutions, and my invitation is for us to think about how we might make best use of that love. You might be surprised by this. We Unitarian Universalists like to think of ourselves as individualists or rebels. Many of us have rejected the religious institutions in which we grew up. Like Ralph Waldo Emerson, we seek to free ourselves from the trammels of tradition and become acquainted at first hand with the divine. Like Henry David Thoreau, we aspire to follow the beat of a different drummer. But Emerson left the Unitarian ministry, and Thoreau wrote a letter to the Concord Church asking them to take him off their membership rolls. They are not our true fathers in faith, only our eccentric and beloved uncles. Our real ancestors were Emerson's and Thoreau's sisters and daughters who heard what they had to say, but kept on coming to church Sunday after Sunday. So I invite you to think about why you keep on coming. All of you are here today. Some of you were here last Sunday and the Sunday before. A few of you show up a couple times between Sundays. I ask you, why? You probably don't imagine that regular attendance at this church is a ticket to heaven. Personally, I've never quite shaken the nagging worry that hanging out in UU churches might keep me out of heaven. But here we are, all the same. You probably aren't here out of sheer habit because you can't imagine anything else to do on a Sunday morning. Most of us have had periods in our lives when we didn't attend worship regularly, but for some reason we came back, or came for the first time and stayed. And you aren't here because you've never heard an argument against church-going. Perhaps you've even heard Emerson's famous account of a boring sermon he once attended in Concord, Massachusetts. People go where they are wont to go, Emerson recalled, else had no soul entered the temple that afternoon. A snowstorm was falling around us. The snowstorm was real. The preacher merely spectral. Perhaps you too have heard a sermon or two that was less interesting than a snowstorm. Perhaps you're hearing one right now. Luckily for me, I only have a rainstorm to compete with. But rain, snow, or sun, you keep coming back. I don't know the exact motives that brought each of you here today. But I invite you to consider the possibility that you are in love with this congregation as an institution. Your love might not be rational. Your mind might be a Thoreauvian rebel, but still your body is here. If you're like me, you love institutions with body and soul, even against your better judgment. If that's your situation, then the logical question might not be why, but what next? What can you, as someone who loves institutions even against your better judgment, do to bless the world? This is an urgent question for people like you and like me who find ourselves connected to institutions that are blessed with abundant resources. For 400 years, my employer, Harvard University, has displayed a knack for accumulating wealth, knowledge, and prestige. This congregation isn't nearly as old as Harvard, but you do have more than 50 years' experience sharing your wealth with other institutions, including Harvard Divinity School. As you know, there would be no Emerson Chair at Harvard were it not for the generosity and leadership of this congregation. And for that, I'm very grateful. As a member of the UUA's panel on theological education, I also know how much you've done for Meadville Lombard, for Starr King, and for UU theological education more generally. Seminary education is in crisis today, but you've kept it alive for Unitarian Universalists. By supporting UU institutions, you're swimming against the current. Churches and other institutions are going through hard times. 2 decades ago, conservative churches were growing and liberal churches were shrinking. Now, almost every church struggles to find members, conservatives, liberals, and UUs alike. Fewer and fewer Americans are willing to identify with either of the major political parties. Membership in labor unions is half what it was a generation ago. The US government is controlled by people who make no secret of their disdain for government, and that's hardly unique. The Brexit process in the United Kingdom, the chaos in places like Syria and Yemen, all are symptoms of a global loss of faith in institutions. It seems that we're at an end of an era. Many of our institutions, including this congregation, were born during or after the Second World War to restore peace to a wounded world. As these institutions face threats to their survival, we must ask, what will preserve peace in our future? And we must ask, what should lovers of institutions like us do? It would be tempting to say, let's defend our beloved institutions. But that would be the wrong choice. Many institutions live longer than human individuals, but no institution can live forever. Perhaps some of our institutions that we have loved may need to die in order for new institutions to rise and take their place. If so, our first task is to ensure that our beloved institutions are seedbeds for the growth of new institutions for the future. Luckily for us, this is what Unitarian Universalists have always done. When changing historical circumstances have rendered old institutions dysfunctional, we've stepped forward with creative ideas about new institutions. 2 centuries ago, Harvard Divinity School was founded by Unitarian ministers who believed that their newly democratic nation needed a new kind of ministry. William Ellery Channing called our first students to make a great revolution in the world through their ministry. And that's what we still try to do today at the Divinity School. 2 generations after Channing, Mary Safford and her sisters in ministry planted thriving congregations in farming communities across the Iowa prairie. In those days, most Harvard graduates were not willing to venture that far from the East Coast. But Safford and her sisters knew that the liberal spirit could thrive not only in cosmopolitan cities, but also in rural villages. And she helped create a long tradition of prairie progressivism. The same liberal creativity was alive during the Second World War. Unitarians and Universalists helped create all the global institutions that are now in jeopardy. Among them were the sisters Martha and Abby Elliott. Abby was a pioneer in the nursery school movement. Martha and her life partner, Ethel Dunham, worked for the Federal Children's Bureau, where they ensured that care for vulnerable children would be part of the new Social Security system. Martha globalized these values by helping to found UNICEF and the World Health Organization. Other Unitarians and Universalists devoted their lives to the League of Women Voters, the NAACP, and the United Nations. Abby and Martha's brother, Fred Elliott, led the Unitarian denomination through the 1940s and 1950s. During those years, he called on Unitarians and Universalists to form a unified liberal church and mobilize the full energy and resources of religious liberalism for the defense and extension of the democratic way of life. He put that vision into practice by organizing the Unitarian Service Committee, which saved hundreds of people from the Holocaust. Other Unitarian leaders shared the same ideal. Democracy, preached A. Powell Davies, is its own religion, worthy of the same devotion that more conventionally religious people pour out in worship of God. Ethicist James Luther Adams pointed out that self-governing local congregations are places where people can learn to be active citizens. And he brought the activated citizens of his congregation with him when he organized the Independent Voters of Illinois, building a progressive political foundation for the careers of Adlai Stevenson, Paul Douglas, and many years after his own death, the career of Barack Obama. Educator Aurelia Reinhardt, who served the Unitarian denomination as moderator during the Second World War, insisted that continuous renewal of public schools would enable them to create democratic citizens for the new era. Your own congregation was born during this same time of global crisis and Unitarian creativity. In the midst of World War, 4 families gathered to create a religious education program for their children. Like Aurelia Reinhardt, they recognized that a democratic future required progressive education, and that such education required institutional support. When you prospered as a result of Carolyn Beach's gift, you wisely invested in Unitarian Universalist institutions and also in a much wider array of institutions that carry liberal religious values out into the world. All of this that you've helped to build is under siege today. Our task is not so much to defend every institution at all costs, but to ensure that their spirit can live on, if need be, in new institutional forms. One way we can do this is by making the institutional resources that we enjoy fully available to the young. For a paradox of the current global rebellion against institutions is that it's mostly a rebellion of the old. Young voters in the United Kingdom did not vote for Brexit. Young voters in the United States did not support dismantling public education, undermining the Affordable Care Act, or closing our nation's doors to immigrants and refugees. The young know that the well-being of all depends on the depth of our commitment to the most vulnerable. But many of the young do not trust the institutions created by their parents and grandparents and great-grandparents. They don't trust the federal government that has continually cut welfare programs while sending young people to die in fruitless wars. They don't trust police departments that allow the killing of young people with black or brown skin. They don't trust political parties that have sold themselves to Wall Street. And young people, not all, but most young people don't trust the churches. Neither the conservative churches that stigmatize queer and trans people, nor the liberal churches that too often look like social clubs for their parents' generation. All of this distrust adds up to a lack of engagement. Fewer than a third of adults under 30 attend religious services regularly, and only half of them voted in the last election. If James Luther Adams was right about congregations as laboratories for democracy, these statistics probably have a lot to do with one another. when young people experience our congregations as unwelcoming or unappealing, our politics suffer as well. Our challenge then is to open the doors of our churches to the young, not only by making them feel welcome at worship, but by supporting whatever religious or spiritual or political or community-building projects they might devise. It can start with our public support for all the activist movements that have been created by the young, for Black Lives Matter, for climate justice divestment campaigns, for the water protectors at Standing Rock, for the Dreamers. When older, mostly white Unitarian Universalists speak publicly in support of these impulses, we signal that we're willing to invest in institutions not of our own design. The next step is to turn our congregations into everyday organizing centers for any group that feels a need to organize. The point is not that if people come to an organizing meeting in the church, they might join the congregation. The point is that the congregation has an obligation to use its resources to renew the public sphere. If we do this, sooner or later we may find ourselves on the receiving end of the violence that is directed against young black and brown bodies, queer and trans bodies, Muslim and immigrant bodies in the US and around the world. That's happened before. In the 1960s, when the murders of Jimmy Lee Jackson and Medgar Evers and James Chaney and Denise McNair and Carol Robertson and Cynthia Wesley and Addie McCollins and so many other black freedom fighters finally inspired Unitarian Universalists to join Martin Luther King in the Selma March of 1965. Two of those Unitarian Universalists, James Reeb and Viola Liuzzo, lost their lives. When our congregation in Knoxville, Tennessee became known as a place that would stand with the victims and survivors of domestic violence, one perpetrator of that violence took out his rage in a shooting rampage that killed 2 parishioners. Some of the churches that have declared themselves sanctuaries for immigrants, including Fourth Universalist in New York City, have experienced vandalism and threats. My own congregation has had to replace our Black Lives Matter sign at least half a dozen times. But here's the beautiful thing about institutions. They have a remarkable capacity to blunt the forces of violence. The knives and bullets that so easily pierce the flesh of the young, the poor, and the marginalized will often slow to a stop when they hit the solid oak of a church door. When our buildings and our signs are attacked, we have the institutional power to invite politicians, journalists, and celebrities to join us in rededicating them. Likewise, the presence of so many church people at Selma motivated the passage of the Voting Rights Act in a way that tragically a century of lynchings and racist violence had failed to do. In every movement for social justice, institutions have played an important, if not especially illustrious, role. The movement usually begins with the courageous witness of a single individual, often a direct victim of violence. It might be someone escaping from slavery, refusing to take the back seat on a bus, or speaking out against the hydroelectric dam that threatens her village in Guatemala. It's all too easy for the forces of violence to murder such prophetic individuals. But when an institution takes the side of the prophets, the work of violence becomes more difficult. There's little heroism in this. Mostly the heroism belongs to the individuals who spoke out first. But it's important all the same. In times like this, we who are stewards of powerful institutions are called to listen to the prophetic voices of the young, whether they are inside or outside our institutions. At Harvard, it might be the voices of dreamers who wonder if they will still be able to continue as students after DACA disappears. In the UUA, it might be the voices of Black lives of UU. Or it might be still younger and quieter voices, like those of the Florida teenagers who've been speaking out about the gun violence that took the lives of their classmates. These are the voices that can help us reshape our institutions for the future. The work of blessing the world through our institutions is not work for saints or heroes. It's not work for people who want to make it into history books. Neither the UUA nor Harvard is likely to get top billing when historians tell the story of how the people of the early 21st century turned back a tide of racism and nationalism and created new institutions to spread generosity and cooperation. Top billing will go instead to Black Lives Matter and the Dreamers and those young people in Florida, and rightly so. Our task as a congregation, as a denomination, is easier theirs, and our reward will simply be this: we might get invited to the party. The work of blessing the world through our institutions is not work for heroes, but it is work for lovers. I said at the beginning that Unitarian Universalism is a movement of people who love institutions even against our better judgment. But we need not choose between our love and our judgment. When we open our institutions to the future and use them to blunt the forces of violence, both our minds and our hearts will be able to say Amen. And the generations that come after us will be able to fall just as deeply in love as we have here. May it be so. And now please rise in body or spirit and join in singing our final hymn, number 1017, Building a New Way, in your turquoise hymn book. 1017. Go forth, all you who love this congregation. Take with you the love you have felt here and the institutional strength of this place. Use them both to bless the world. Amen.